Tonight on Nation to Nation, the UNDRIP bill is slowly making its way through committee in Ottawa. But if Bill C-15 is actually going to work, it'll come down to money, says this economic policy expert.
If there isn't some sort of funding source, UNDRIP and all the 46 clauses aren't going to fly.
Welcome to Nation to Nation, and hello, I'm Todd Lamourant. You've heard us talk a lot about Bill C-15 on this show. It's the legislation that, if passed, will make sure Canada's laws follow the principles of the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's also known as UNDRIP. There's a lot in this bill, that Indigenous people have the right to practice their culture, to the right to self-determination. But discussions inevitably boil down to, it'll give Indigenous people the right to veto resource development. To help unpack this bill somewhat, I'm joined by Mark Podlasly. He's the Director of Economic Policy for the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, a collection of 70 First Nations. Their goal? To make sure First Nations get a fair share from project development in their territories. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Podlasly.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Mr. Podlasly, earlier this week you appeared before the House's Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and you said Article 4 of Bill C-15 is the key to successfully implementing UNDRIP in Canada. Why is that?
Well, the United Nations Declaration very much provides for self-determination for our peoples. And the Article 4 references the ability to finance that, the ways and means to finance autonomous functions. If there isn't some sort of funding source, UNDRIP and all the 46 clauses aren't going to fly. The question about getting a funding source is integral to any government, Indigenous or not. No government will be able to continue to provide services or operate without some way of funding itself.
Now, from what you've told me and from what I heard of you in committee, why is it that what is supposedly a human rights bill, the discussions surrounding it inevitably focus on what this might mean for those interested in investing in resource development projects in Canada?
Well, a lot of the questions from the resource companies and the institutional investors are focused on certainty or risk avoidance. So for a lot of these companies, they see Indigenous people having an ability to say no to projects as a risk that they're trying to either avoid or don't want implemented. At the coalition and the 70 members that we represent, we don't look at it that way. We're not against development, we're for pro-smart development. And that means industries or operations that respect our cultures, our traditions, and our environment, and provide an avenue for communities to have a own source revenue stream to fund the self-determination priorities that we, under UNDRIP, will decide for ourselves.
So why is it that opponents to Bill C-15 are focused on whether or not it gives First Nations a veto on resource development? And does it give that veto?
Well, the question about it being a veto or not is something that we at the coalition have not focused on. We are focusing more on the self-determination and all the other things that come with UNDRIP, like the ability to set our own education systems, to set up media in our own language, to improve our territories, to be revenue sharing and controlling in our territories of those things that directly impact us. Our perspective on the question of FPIC, is it a veto or not, is that if First Nations are directly involved in projects that are compatible with our interests, then we essentially are co-proponents. And if we are co-proponents, we're never going to be in a situation where we're going to veto or block our own economic and social interests.
Now, you just mentioned FPIC, which stands for Free, Prior, and Informed Consent. But how does industry reach free, prior, and informed consent when an elected chief and council can give it, but another group doesn't and takes direct action, such as what happened in northern BC with the Wet'suwet'en and what happened there with the pipeline?
So the question of what happened in northern BC, where you have some First Nations agreeing to the project and others not, is something that's going to have to be worked out internally among First Nations. The challenge in that situation is that you have an elected government system imposed on a hereditary system. So it's a clash of government systems that was put in place by the Indian Act. That's a colonial legacy. So what's happening in that situation is those First Nations are talking and trying to resolve that, and they're trying to do it on their own timetable. When we at the coalition have had governments come to us, or industry particularly, and say, why can't you all agree on something? Our response is, oh, like the Canadian government and all the provinces, like that? You mean there's a unanimous agreement when every government decision comes down? Well, there isn't. And we will work this out, and we will have to come to some sort of agreement internally. That will take time. But For industry looking for certainty, that's the only way it's going to be certain. Anything imposed from outside, and we've seen this happen over and over in Canadian history, doesn't stand the test of time.
Now, a couple of things from what you just said. One is you mentioned the Indian Act, and if we're talking about a piece of legislation that doesn't adhere to the principles of UNDRIP, that's got to be it. Do you foresee Bill C-15 doing something about that?
Well, the Indian Act as it is now is not compatible with UNDRIP because it is not a collaborative working arrangement between two equal partners. UNDRIP by itself was written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people to help level the playing field between the communities and the nations and the host state. So the Indian Act as it is will not stand up against the principles of UNDRIP. What comes next, though, is the whole question of what is the engagement going to be between our peoples and the federal government. That will take time, and that is what UNDRIP spirit is about.
Now, you also talked about competing interests between those who may favor a development and those who don't. So what, industry, I guess, is kind of on the sidelines then until these things are figured out. Does that not create uncertainty for industry if they're wanting to invest in a resource project?
There are examples already, very positive examples, how Indigenous people and industry are working together. There's transmission lines in Northern Ontario. There's one in Alberta. There are power generation, green energy facilities happening with Indigenous ownership and Indigenous participation at all levels, from the investment decision right through to management and corporate decisions. First Nations and industry is not waiting for UNDRIP. The spirit of it is already happening. And at the Coalition, we've been very active in trying to spread that word around, going, this is what UNDRIP means in practice. In many ways, the federal government coming to the table with the legislation is just trying to catch up with what a lot of communities are already doing with industry and what industry sees as the positive future.
Now, one of the reasons you spoke out at committee and why there's a committee in the first place is to try and work on what are maybe the weaknesses of the current legislation in current clauses in Bill C-15. What do you see as a weakness that must be fixed before this is given royal assent?
The question about UNDRIP will be in the implementation. It will pass the House and it will pass through and put into legislation, but unless there's a plan on how to actually implement this, and it means a new way of doing business between Indigenous people, industry, and government, unless that's thought through about how these questions like what we raised on Article 4, how do First Nations finance all these rights and abilities to put in these things? Unless that's done, it will not work. So our question on this is usually around capital access. For First Nations to be involved in the industry and the projects that are in their territories, we have to have some way to have affordable capital to get into the game. And again, this is up to the First Nation. It's not being imposed. If a First Nation wants to participate in a project in their territories, that's great. They will make the decision, but they need to have some access to capital, and that means money.
Isn't this the kind of thing that's supposed to be worked out, I guess, if it's passed? Because if Bill C-15 is passed, nothing gets implemented right away. There's supposed to be this action plan, and there's a 3-year deadline on the action plan. So is this when some of these things are supposed to get worked out?
I would hope that the government's already thinking about these questions, but it's important for us as Indigenous people to be ready to know what our action plan will be. So yes, they should be worked out in that 3-year period. But again, UNDRIP is about a partnership between Indigenous people and the host state. It's up to us as well to come in and lay out where our priorities are going. And that's the ultimate goal of self-determination, us making our own decisions on our own priorities and then implementing them. UNDRIP provides a framework how the federal government will respond to that, but it is a partnership. And yes, it will take some time.
Of course, in British Columbia, which is where you're based in, there's been a provincial version of UNDRIP for almost a year and a half. What is the status of that, and what do you expect it to do to change your relationship, especially with resource development?
The provincial government in British Columbia has introduced a bill implementing UNDRIP, you're right, at the provincial level. And what's happened is that there is also a plan, and they are underway on that. It is slow. It will take years to undo 150 years of colonial administration. But what's happening here is that in this province, the province has got many tables going with First Nations and First Nations organization, and is asking the tough questions about what kind of society do we collectively want to be? Is this a province of resources, development, civil society? And if so, how does that look? One other thing I want to raise is that this whole question between government and First Nations, or provincial government and First Nations, about what the province will look like is being watched by the capital markets, the institutional investors, and those groups that want to invest in the province. So the BC government is well aware of that, and so are First Nations. So we are moving down a path to implement UNDRIP in this province, and the discussions are underway. This, again, will take time. One does not undo 150 years of colonial actions overnight.
Now, I want to circle back to at the beginning of our conversation when we talked about Article 4. But again, as you pointed out in committee, there are 45 other articles in the proposed legislation. What else stands out for you?
Well, the questions that come forward about questions about our traditional territories and our lands and the say that we will have on those. So the relationship in British Columbia to First Nations is more nuanced because we don't have treaties. Not some treaties, but for the most part, no. So the question then comes up is how do we joint manage the resources of this land? This will apply to treated lands as well, is the relationship, because the treaties themselves also are part of the Canadian fabric, the Canadian Constitution under Section 35. So what stands out to me now? What kind of relationship are we going to have as true equals? That will be a new experience for the Government of Canada, and I think it's exciting for Indigenous people.
If the Prime Minister calls a spring election and C-15 isn't passed and dies on the order paper, and if the Liberals are re-elected, do you think they'll reintroduce this legislation?
Yes. And I have an answer for that too, and that would come up in the previous meeting. This is an international document. UNDRIP is being adopted by over 100 nations around the world, and it's no longer a question of if it will be implemented or adopted worldwide. It is being implemented, and the world is watching. The capital markets are watching. Canada will have to move down this path at some point.
The Conservatives have consistently opposed any UNDRIP legislation, so if they want a possible spring election, would they then need to introduce their own version of Bill C-15?
They will have little choice in the matter because the capital markets are looking for certainty. UNDRIP provides investment certainty. It provides clarity for those people putting money into the country to know what that money is going to be exposed to. So the Conservatives will have to do something to address that. It's a world market for capital. It goes where there's safety. And if it's another jurisdiction like Australia or Peru or Colombia, then they will go there.
Well, Mr. Podlasly, I want to thank you for giving me your thoughts on this. It's been illuminating for sure.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Coming up, we speak to the chief of the Lennox Island First Nation in Prince Edward Island. She'll talk about her community's Ice Walk.